What are y'all doing here on a Sunday afternoon? Thank you so much. I really appreciate you guys coming out. Okay, so like Amanda said, this is an experiment. I have never done this before. I have always kind of wanted to do this. But in the spirit of experiments, like, it could fail. It could be a success, it could be neutral, it could be lots of things in between. But what I'm going to do is read the catalog essay from start to finish, which will have a slightly durational quality. In the hopes or the dream of marrying the two essays, right? There's an essay in space, which is the exhibition, and there's an essay in this book that is what I think and feel about what's going on in these rooms. These two things rarely, if ever, meet. And instead, what typically happens, and what Amanda asked me to do, was like, would I come and give a tour of the show in which I perform like my favorites? And I have to be honest, I both love and hate that tour. I love it because I'm performative and I'm a ham and I get all this love energy back from the crowd and I get sort of filled up and my ego gets puffed up and, you know, all of that ego stuff happens. But I also hate it because at the end of it, people invariably say the same things to me. Oh my God, I never would have gotten any of that if you hadn't been here. Oh my God, you're so funny, you should do stand-up. Right? And like, oh my God, I wish everyone could hear you. Why doesn't the museum make an audio guide? So instead of having that experience as my final public experience at MOCA, which, let's just have a moment, this is my final public appearance at MOCA, I decided we're going to do this shit my way. So when you get bored of sitting, remember to walk around, because there's plenty to see in this show. But again, thank you. Thank you very much. The essay is called One Day at a Time, and it has two epigraphs. The first one is from Hilton Als's book, White Girls. The ego, what a racket. The second is from Thomas Pynchon's The Crying of Lot 49. Oedipa wondered whether, at the end of this, if it were supposed to end, she too might not be left with only compiled memories of clues, announcements, intimations, but never the central truth itself, which must somehow each time be too bright for her memory to hold, which must always blaze out, destroying its own message irreversibly, leaving an overexposed blank when the ordinary world came back. Manny Farber. Our leading man was born in 1917, the same year Marcel Duchamp entered Fountain into the Society of Independent Artists exhibition under the pseudonym R. Mutt. This might not be the best way to begin the story, but it's a coincidental fact nonetheless. Duchamp and our protagonist's stories intertwine in the negative, inasmuch as Duchamp, through his introduction of an everyday store-bought object into the field of art, an item called a ready-made, profoundly changed the category of art. His iconoclastic gesture has been used for over a century to shore up the perpetual death notice of painting. Our leading man took notice, but ended up a painter nonetheless. After decades of carpentry, writing film criticism, and teaching, it was studio life that caught him. He showed up in youthful Southern California in 1970, already 53 years old, having driven cross-country from New York in an old taxi cab with his girlfriend, Patricia Patterson, a fellow artist, sometime collaborator, and his soon-to-be wife. That summer, Close to You by the Carpenters and Ball of Confusion by the Temptations were topping the charts. The couple spent their nights in national parks, and they rolled into La Jolla, California with almost no possessions and even less cash. He was there to teach painting at the University of California, San Diego, but it turned out that UCSD professor and poet David Anton, who gave them $20 to tide him over, knew who he was and said, "Why don't you teach the history of film as well?" And just like that, he was given a painting studio on the then decade-old UCSD campus and started to teach what would become the legendary VA 84, History of Film. Farber then began to stock the newly formed art department with contrarians, filmmaker Jean-Pierre Guérin, camerawoman and photographer Babette Mangold, artist Ree Morton, folks who were rubbing up against the boundary of ideas about narrative and medium. His wife Patterson started to teach as well, first painting and then classes on utopian communities, art, and artists. William Morris, the Shakers, De Style, the Russian constructivists, all of whom, or which, it should be noted, trafficked in the revolutionary potential of the decorative. I arrived much later. Sometime early in the summer of 1987, I flew from New York to San Diego at the invitation of a friend who offered free lodging, meaning the sofa, in an apartment her boyfriend had already paid the rent on through September. She was the first artist I knew who was my age. In other words, she was the first artist I knew who wasn't dead. I had been studying art history, David, Goya, Géricault. She had been reading Gertrude Stein and Roland Barthes. I worked a temp office job in Manhattan, answering phones at the front desk of a public relations firm. Once I had made enough money for the one-way ticket, I quit and flew west. San Diego was about as exotic a locale as a girl from Flushing, Queens could imagine. Birds of paradise grew like dandelions in front of two-story apartment buildings. Back home, they were $5 a stem, sold in buckets outside of corner delis. My new friends all listened to punk, read theory, and had a slightly hostile relationship to the overwhelming beauty of the coastline, which they displayed by dyeing their hair black and generally staying indoors. I drove to the beach every day after work to gawk at the Pacific and upped my intellectual game by reading essays by Leo Steinberg and Marcel Proust. By the end of the summer, I had resolved to finish my last year of college at UCSD. I was in the thrall of some of my peers, who were, in turn, in the thrall of Manny Farber. To be honest, I'm not sure I was ever officially enrolled in Manny Farber's lecture class in the fall-winter quarter of 1988. I was a bit of an academic grifter with a fairly attenuated relationship to university protocols such as attendance and registration. And look where it got me. Very publicly fired, so I encourage all of you to cut class. The buzz around my circle of friends about how it was going to be Manny's last class, combined with the fact that my then boyfriend and roommates were TAs for the course, conspired to place me in an auditorium on any given evening, slack-jawed with my mind reeling, as I watched Jean-Luc Godard's Le Carabinier, that scene where the two dopey cops and all of their postcards, and Preston Sturges' slapstick Hollywood picture, The Palm Beach Story, that scene with Claudette Colbert in glamorous men's pajamas, and Rainer Werner Fassbinder's Katzelmacher, that scene with Hanna Shagula dancing in the shortest miniskirt ever. So far, so good. But where he really got me to sit up straight in my seat was during the screening of Martin Scorsese's Mean Streets. He showed the opening scene several times, once straight through, once without sound, and once while he spoke, or something like that. It's unclear to me how much of my memory I can trust. When Farber talked, he talked about how Robert De Niro moved like a dancer. And he asked us to watch carefully as De Niro moved his body through the streets, to see how the character seemed to inhabit his physical frame, how a low hum of criminality was embodied in those lilting footsteps, the compactness of his hips over his knees. All this just before he put a cherry bomb in a mailbox on a street corner in downtown New York and scampered away, his entire body looking like a shit-eating grin. Even as the early 1970s palette of the film made me long for home, I knew I would never watch a movie in the same way again. Farber had destroyed my suspension of disbelief, replacing it with a keen attention to detail. Indeed, he taught me in that instance to let myself be distracted by the minutiae that were operating on a different level from the master plot. It was a total inversion of everything I had understood about interpretation up until that moment. And then that was that. He retired. I went on to take more classes, watch more films, meet more artists, and write my first pieces of criticism for the local San Diego art paper. The path that led me to the life I lead today, in which my work as a curator occupies the central axis of my identity, had unfurled, and I was on it, although I did not know I was on this path at that time. Certainly, when I sat in Manny's lecture hall, I had no inkling of what a curator even did, this being the time before the profession had achieved its bizarre cult status. And my current understanding of its operations, demanding a constant oscillation between the big picture and the details, the big picture being the institution of the museum and its central role in the creation of value, the formation of canons, and the presentation of private artistic acts for public experience, and the details involving the development of intimacies with both objects and their makers, the why and how of choosing specific objects, the why and how of installing them, and what each act of adjacency in an installation might connote, all of that was still a decade away. During those heady college days, I, like so many others, developed a crush on the 20th century's call for art to broker an arrangement with life. My cohort and I existed in the slipstream of the teachings by those who had lived through and believed in the revolutionary potential of 1968. We combined that with the punk and hip-hop leanings of our own generation, and I, like so many others, was more than happy to reject high culture for its own sake, more than happy to reject contemplation as the primary form of viewership, connoisseurship as the framing device for taste. Feminism blossomed in me, and in the closing years of the 1980s, having not yet learned the ills of essentialism, I found myself interested in the labor, thoughts, practices, ideas, and stories of the half of the world's population that had been systematically overlooked and undervalued. In other words, I was interested in women. This meant that I was interested in decor and the decorative and decorum, and by extension, housework, interior decorating, and style. I was compelled to reclaim under-recognized women artists. I was turned on by the proposition that the canon could be refashioned to make their concerns central rather than peripheral. Then I learned that there was no center and no periphery, and that's when things started to get really interesting. Everyone, by which I mean the art students hanging around UCSD's original Mandeville studio building, knew that Manny and Patricia were painters, and the gossip about them, their love, her fabled garden, their magical life, hung in the air. It would be decades before I looked at their work seriously, even as my interest in the everyday grew more acute and poignant over time. Back then, I could not have seen their work for what it was. I was too much in the grips of what I thought were the exclusively serious concerns of critical theory. Now, I find my attraction to the everyday to be a form of defense against what I perceive to be the near total eclipse of criticism by the market values of art as an asset class, the demand for museums to produce blockbuster shows, and the apotheosis of profit as the primary marker of cultural value that I see embedded in the frictionless finish fetish of Jeff Koons, the narcissistic grandiosity of Damien Hirst, or the production of charm without affect by Takashi Murakami. Harsh judgments for sure. This is like the one ameliorative sentence in this whole fucking essay. Are you ready for it? Because here it is. This was the sentence I wrote before I knew I was going to get fired. Harsh judgments for sure. And I don't mean to suggest that I don't find any of those artists interesting. She hedges. M dash. It's just that the ideas and affects that their works promulgate are commensurate with the neoliberal values of pure market exchange, hedge funds, and financial instruments. I find myself longing for the days when art and culture were considered spaces where the human characteristics of curiosity, empathy, and critique held stronger sway. I think that my belated interest in Farber and Patterson's work means that I need their version of the everyday now. I need to think about what people actually do with their time, how they come together at table, how we create spaces for fellowship and exchange that are not measured by metrics borrowed from the for-profit world. Perhaps this is why I am brought to my knees by Moira Davies' photographs of empty booze bottles on the still dirty kitchen counter. Maybe this is why the well-ordered and closely observed interiors of Becky Suss's paintings, with their flat planes of pastel color and their well-placed vases and pillows, produce such strong feelings of kinship in me. Still life, nature morte, trompe-l'oeil, vanitas, these kinds of images are as old as representation itself. The myth of Zeuxis established the game of representation to be one of illusion and the everyday, grapes painted with such tenderness that they fool the birds. It appears as if the 20th century's profound questioning of art, what it is, what it can be, what it's good for, what it does, has not yet produced any scorched earth around the filiation we have for still life's uncanny ability to represent the world as it exists, complete with its ever-transitory dailiness and its messy conditions. It turns out that the official culture of monuments to white men on horseback who won wars, or, perversely, in this country, statues of those white men who lost a war, placed in the public square, feels as antiquated as having a man deliver milk to the house each morning. It's a distant memory, cold air, the texture of the bottles, thick glass rims, the sounds the empty bottles made in their metal carrier when it was placed on the rough concrete of the stoop. Nevertheless, Wolfgang Tillman's still life of food remnants eaten out of hand persists in capturing my imagination. Part of this epochal, I don't even know how to say that word, epochal, E-P-O-C-H-L-A-L, part of that word's attraction must surely be the eternal return of the same, the plus ça change quality of it all. No matter how much we love our iPhones, we all must eat, and eating, being at table, with all its implied necessity and conviviality, remains a constant, a truth even. And yet, the cranky feminist in me resents having to feel so cranky. And yet, the recent foodie revolution hasn't produced a society committed to the migrant workers who pick our food, just as the new love of craft in the art world has yet to produce a canon of anonymous practitioners, and the intimacy between the art world and gentrification, i.e., the creation of increasing amounts of wealth held in the name of real estate, has not enabled much dignity to be bestowed on the folks, primarily brown, predominantly women, who keep all those new homes clean. I digress. In 1978, Patricia Patterson wrote an essay for Heresies, a journal born of feminism's dramatic eruption in the art world. In it, she writes gently of the everyday aesthetic practices of women in Ireland's Aran Islands, which Patterson had visited and which had a transformative effect on her. She wondered if perhaps the women themselves did not conceive of their domestic labors of arranging and repairing and knitting as aesthetic acts, but she noted them duly nonetheless. And then she tried to paint them, shallow domestic interiors where women spoke to one another of the things that structured their lives. In her essay, she takes note of the ceramic roosters that dotted the windowsills of Aran. Reading it, I recalled the quixotic collection of ceramic roosters that punctuated the margins of Patterson and Farber's home in Leucadia. She must have brought them back from her trips, I thought, remembering how all of the window sashes and jambs in their home were painted bright, flat shades of lemon yellow, robin's egg blue, or a milky verdant green. A palette that lives on in the furniture and sculptures of Roy McMakin, a student of Manny and Patricia's at UCSD. Their house began its life as a modest beach bungalow, probably no larger than 700 square feet, with a beautiful row of 4-over-4 paned windows that lined the bedroom. When Patterson realized Manny would lose his studio upon retiring from UCSD, she set about redesigning their home. "I got busy," she said. She added 2 new wings, making it a U-shaped structure, each addition acting as a studio, one for Manny, one for her. Both studios connected to the original house, and both opened out onto the garden via the French doors so typical of the indoor-outdoor architecture of Southern California. The garden was and remains a gentleman's agreement between the planned and the neglected, filled with old-growth roses that climb to the roof, pomegranate trees, artichokes allowed to go to flower along with their sibling thistles, apple and lemon trees, parsley and mint, bougainvillea, rosemary, a fig tree, and a host of flowering plants that as an Easterner, I sheepishly still don't know the names of. During one of my visits, Patricia described how Manny worked. She started at the beginning when they were living in a loft in New York in the 1960s. Farber painted large abstract paintings then on brown craft paper that he layered with wet paint and muslin. He would wake up in the middle of the night to go to the studio to turn them so that they would dry properly. After he removed the muslin, he used a chalk-encrusted thread to snap drawn lines on their mottled and variegated surfaces. All of this took place on the floor. Sometime in the mid to late 1970s, he began making modest, square format oil paintings on paper. Images of stationery supplies and candy littered the pictorial field in an all-over composition lifted directly from the Abex playbook. When it came to depicting the stuff of the world, Farber did not take his cues from pop. He preferred to miniaturize rather than to blow up. And despite the precise rendering of bottles of whiteout and Hershey's candy bars, the fetishism of the brand doesn't seem to be what's at play. What was at stake was the ubiquitous nature of the things themselves, their commonness, and their appearance in the spaces of work. The labor of representation was very specifically acknowledged in the ground of the composition, for Farber painted in an almost trompe-l'oeil spirit the craft paper etched by the lines of an X-Acto knife. The grounds of these small paintings counterintuitively offered the residue of a process via the logic of representation. The painted paper background acted as a segue between abstraction and representation, and its resolute flatness was simultaneously offered as a plane of color and a surface troubled by the painted rendition of cut lines. Some of these drawings bore titles that hooked them up to Farber's other great passion, the cinema, as in the painting of an open box of Red Hots and a broken Hershey bar titled Mrs. McCabe and Mrs. Miller. Remember that scene where Warren Beatty chases the elusive Julie Christie in the winter forest, and how director Robert Altman perfectly captured the muffled quality of sound in the snow. The workplace tableau ultimately gave way to large, slightly unwieldy canvases that, because of convention, we call still life, although truth be told, they are anything but still. Rather, they appear to race and pulse with an energy that might be called cinematic, as they jog along, establishing both the connections and breaks between the things they represent: handwritten notes, open books of Japanese shunga, which are the erotic prints, flowers, gardening and painting tools, books, toy figurines, miniature train tracks, plates of fruit, notepads, rulers, strips of film leader, matches, razor blades, glasses of water, seed pods, detritus from the neighboring Batiquitos lagoon, rebar and vegetables from the nearby Chino farm. Farber's still life paintings were also conceived horizontally. First, he laid the canvas or board flat on a table. Then he prepared a colored ground. These typically planar and rectangular grounds were frequently divided, black and white or contrasting colors. This seemingly simple act of dividing the canvas into bands of color destabilizes both the visual and conceptual aspects of the ground as fundamental to the figure ground dyad, so essential to representational painting. And upon this compromised ground, Farber placed the actual objects of his everyday life: plates of half-eaten food, scrawled notes, open books, before climbing a ladder to look down at the composition forming before him. Then, with a pencil taped to a long piece of rebar, he proceeded to trace the outlines of all of the forms. He would remove and replace the objects at will, and would commence new tracings. Patricia would bring flowers from the garden into Manny's studio, and he would say, "Put them there," gesturing with rebar to the place where he wanted them to go. It was, she recalled, their way of communicating without interrupting the work of the day. What she didn't say was that they were gifts, tokens of affection, love letters. Termite art. In 1962, Film Culture published Farber's now legendary essay, White Elephant Art versus Termite Art. A mere 9 years later, the article was included in an anthology of Farber's writing titled Negative Space. The essay is a screed against the idea of the masterpiece, a diatribe against monumentality, a manifesto against the narcissism of the artistic ego, replete with lines such as, and I quote, "The painting sculpture assemblage becomes a yawning production of overripe technique, shrieking with preciosity, fame, ambition. Far inside are tiny pillows holding up the artist's signature, now turned into mannerism by the padding, lechery, faking required to combine today's aesthetics with the components of traditional great art." Let's keep going. Quote, "The three sins of White Elephant are: 1, frame the action with an all-over pattern. 2, install every event, character, situation in a frieze of continuities. And 3, treat every inch of the screen and film as a potential area for prize-worthy creativity." These are bad things in Farber's mind. Both quotes refer as much to the sins of Hollywood cinema as they do to New York school painting. Farber's ire regarding a lack of commitment to detail, his disdain for an evinced preference for the smooth and sinuous over the tactile and disjointed, and his deep suspicion of the tyranny of the first-person pronoun all speak to an on-time arrival of Farber and what would become the dominant hallmarks of postmodernism, particularly the postmodernism of a Deleuzian strain, a rhizomatic form of thinking in which horizontality trumps verticality, where all ideas are capable of hooking up with other ideas, and where the I is merely a transitory position occupied provisionally and awkwardly, like this one right now. For French philosopher Gilles Deleuze and for Farber, desire did not come in the form of an aching absence, to be framed and acted and disguised by fame and an all-over composition, but instead came from the contingency of ideas and bodies grasping and releasing one another. But I've rushed ahead a little bit here because the previous sentence is a much better description of a Manny Farber still life painting than it is of the Termite essay. I think it's fair to say that in 1962, Farber was struggling to articulate and validate his neologistic phrase, termite art. Castigating white elephant art was the much more effortless task. Statements of negation are easy. Affirmation, really and truly getting at why something is good or why one values it or why one finds it beautiful, is a much harder proposition. And termite art, even in the hands of a writer as tenacious and innovative as Farber, was no exception. He spends most of his time in this essay dissecting the performances of John Wayne to get at the small gestures and details that constitute his termite tendency. He's at his most explicit when he says that termitism, quote, feels its way through walls of particularization with no sign that the artist has any object in mind other than eating away the immediate boundaries of his art, and turning those boundaries into conditions of the next achievement. This commitment to process, to the artist's own working through of their medium, was not, however, the only characteristic of termite art. Lest the whole project devolve into a kind of studio navel-gazing, Farber clarifies in his introduction, quote, the important trait of termite, fungus, centipede art is its ambulatory creation, which is an act both of observing and being in the world, an act of both observing and being in the world. A journeying in which the artist seems to be ingesting both the material of his art and the outside world through horizontal coverage. In my copy of Negative Space, the sentence above is heavily underlined. It's what has allowed me to hang on. Traditional representation seems to rely on the idea that the artist is somehow separate from the space of the world, sitting at her easel, peering out at her subject. For me, this omnipotent fantasy of objectivity sits at the core of Western civilization and is one of the primary roots of its ills. Farber calls instead for an artist who can navigate the complexities of being in the scene and describing the scene, who can occupy an ethical position of enormous nuance. No pretending objectivity, no pretense towards a state of pure being, but instead a situation in which observation and action, if not exactly simultaneous, are equally valued. Farber would do this in his criticism by breaking with standard grammar, meaning that he never let the form of representation obscure the act of thinking. With all of its ellipses, doubling back, stammers, and revisions. The filmmaker Khalil Joseph, himself deeply gifted at the filmic capturing of details he calls black gesture, once told me that the best part of reading a piece of criticism by Manny is that you get to the end of the essay and you wonder, did he like the movie? Because the liking, of course, isn't the point. The liking or disliking is the intrusion of a hyper-personal ego into the situation of trying to both be with and observe the film. Farber's great friend, the filmmaker Jean-Pierre Gorin, understood the termite part of Farber's essay as a repudiation of the omnipotent I. And I'm quoting here from JP, Jean-Pierre. The advantage of bringing the Farber quote into the debate is that it takes the I out of the equation and aggressively replaces it with the instinctual energy of a bug that prompts generally more a call to the nearest exterminator than a celebration of the aesthetic. J.P. Gorin, and his film is playing behind me. J.P. Gorin, Former collaborator of Jean-Luc Godard shows up in California, meets Farber, and falls for him hard. The feeling is mutual, and Farber got Goran a teaching position at UCSD, where Goran goes on to make a trilogy of essay films dedicated to mapping the bizarre suburbia that is Southern California. The second film in the trilogy, Routine Pleasures, playing behind me, is half about Manny and half about a group of model train enthusiasts and their storefront hobby space in the beach town of Del Mar. It's a buddy movie about termite art where most of the action comes via Goran's befuddled, bemused, and bewildered voiceover. Never explaining nor teaching, the film is essayistic in its observation of the intensity with which a group of grown men attempt to enact rituals designed to impose order on the atropic state of things in their Lilliputian world. Their efforts are as poignant and humorous as Goran's attempts at dissecting the American psyche. The film's sculptural analog is Fischli and Weiss's masterpiece in miniature, Suddenly This Overview, a suite of tabletop, unfired clay sculptures that typologizes the foibles and successes of Western man, making no discernible difference between the two. The failure of the enterprise is built into the work, much like the futile endeavor of trying to exterminate the termites in Southern California that gnaw away at single-story houses without foundations, while the exterminators who tent those very same houses watch as the termites fly back through the open French doors the day the tent is removed. That is an East Coast sentence right there. That's what it feels like if you drive around this town and you're from New York. Goran's first film in the trilogy, Poto and Gabango, was the stuff of legend during my senior year at UCSD. The film followed the local development of a pair of twin sisters who linguists believed had created their own language. To hear Goran recount the origin of the project is to get a glimpse into the film's original game plan. And this is JP talking, and JP has an extremely thick French accent, which I will not imitate, but I lend you this so you perhaps can hear it in the deep Gallic sensibility in which this quote is offered. This is JP. I got hold of the event through the press. It was the middle of the summer and news was sparse. The Loch Ness Monster had been nowhere in sight that year, and I suspect the journalists felt the twins would be a good substitute. They built up a case which reeked of wild child mystique. The very day I saw the first article on the twins, Eckhart Stein from ZDF was passing through town, and I sold him on the idea of a film. I lied through my teeth, told him I had seen the twins, seen the therapists who took care of them at children's hospitals, secured the rights to the story. I assured Stein they spoke a private language. He agreed to do the film, but when I saw the twins for the first time, I immediately realized that the story, as the press and by then myself had cast it, was not there. There was no private language, and there had never been. All along, the twins had spoken a creolized language, some densely unintelligible American English, a patchwork of Southern lingo spoken by their father, and of the deformations imposed on the English language by their German-born mother, close quote. How to make a film about a non-event. How to make a film about the failure of the discourse of discovery and objectivity so crucial to the narratives of science. How to make an anthropological film that neither elevated nor pathologized its subjects. How to make a film about a pair of twin girls communicating in secret that is also a film about the displacement of a French artist in the dry, overdeveloped canyons of San Diego County. The film was mythical among us students because its existence was proof of a category we might call interesting failures. Proof that there was a virtue inherent in chipping away at a project, doing the work, proceeding against the obstacles. There was virtue in not knowing what you were doing. The unintelligibility of Poto and Gabango recalled every punk show you'd ever seen. A bunch of guys who barely knew how to play their instruments, shouting the words to a song you didn't understand, and if you were a girl, trying to make sure that you didn't get hurt in the pit. The scene I remember most vividly is one in which Goran is preparing a meal for the twins in his kitchen. While slicing a cucumber, he holds a thin celadon sliver up to the light and says to the girls, "Look, isn't that beautiful?" Still life. While I was cutting my teeth on the history of cinema according to Farber and its current vicissitudes according to Goran, I was not capable of looking at, much less getting, a Farber painting. Nor was I particularly adept at reading Farber's criticism. Like so many of my generation, I was finding my way through the byways of continental theory to feminism. Feminism as a means to critique patriarchy, and by extension, the very concept of the West. Feminism as a way to rethink the primacy of gender as a tool to structure the world. Feminism as a way to query power, its effects, and one's relationship to it. The idiosyncratic struggles of a couple of white dudes in Southern California wasn't exactly where I was at. So the irony of finding myself now, a woman of a certain age, obsessed with both the Termite essay and Farber's still life paintings, to the point of thinking they might be an interesting set of coordinates around which to build an exhibition, is not lost on me. When I first started explaining the project to people, almost every encounter devolved into playful banter dominated by the question, is, fill in the blank, a termite artist? Surely this game had losing as its only outcome. Clearly, the task of the exhibition was not to produce a category, although of course I was narcissistically interested in valorizing my own curatorial choices. The problem was that the damn essay doesn't make a strong enough case for what termite art is, and it could only partially describe what termite art looked like in action. Termite art was like pornography. You knew it when you saw it. I felt my enterprise to be as flawed as Goran's pursuit in Poto and Gabango. People looked at me blankly, and I would just mumble, defeated, the show is basically about still life, which mollified most of my interlocutors and left me in a pit of pretty huge self-doubt. Until, that is, I found myself sitting in Goran's San Diego department, surrounded by his Jurassic-era DVD library. My laptop doesn't even have a DVD or CD drive anymore. The apartment had one of those classic pink and black tiled bathrooms from the 1940s, a Proustian Madeleine for anyone who has ever lived in Southern California. It also appeared to be dangerously close to the airport. Even though I grew up in the shadow of both LaGuardia and JFK, I flinched with every takeoff and landing. Goran's face remained implacable, reminding me of a phenomena I remembered from my childhood, when my parents' friends from out of town would be surprised by the cacophony above us that no one in my neighborhood even heard. "It's the verses," he said. Of course. The essay is structurally flawed by a false antinomy, an either-or scenario doomed to generate opinions rather than dialogue. Anyway, who wants to have an argument with only two sides? The paintings, on the other hand, operate with the logic of and. The paintings were the enactment of the termite art essay 20 years after the idea had first occurred to Farber. Farber had somewhat famously given up writing in the late 1970s. His last essay, co-written with Patterson in 1977, The Kitchen Without Kitsch, was on Chantal Ackerman's Jean Dillman 23 Quai de Commerce, 1080 Brussels. That's the full title of Jean Dillman. Perhaps, in my view, the most perfect film ever made. Considered by many to be a feminist masterpiece, Jean Dillman was the ultimate suturing of art and life, one that was shot with structuralist rigor by the DP Babette Mangold. The impeccable and implacable Delphine plays a housewife who turns tricks in the afternoon for a living, but the tricks play second fiddle to the real label of housework: cleaning the bath, making the bed, shopping for dinner, making a meatloaf, all represented with quiet dignity in near real time. In Jean Dillman, the everyday is about repetition and duration. Farber and Patterson described it as, quote, a still life film, a genre painting by a 70s Chardin, a 40s story shot by a 70s camera. Farber said that he abandoned writing so he could devote himself entirely to painting. The writing was very difficult, Patterson told me while we sat together in weathered club chairs in Farber's former studio. The paintings don't exactly seem easy, I thought, knowing that wasn't the point. What was clear was that in Farber's hands, painting's complexity, its ability to compress and condense meanings, its capacity to traffic in aporias, which by an aporia is a simultaneously competing reality. We are currently living in an aporia. So painting's capacity to traffic in aporias, its adeptness at registering its process as part and parcel of its final product, rendered painting an essayistic medium without the inherent limitations of writing. Writing has no choice but to be consumed in a linear fashion, the mere incident of one word having to follow another, all of which must in turn cohere into sentences with proper syntax that are then further obliged to coalesce into paragraphs with topic sentences, obliged to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. From left to right, we read one word after another, encountering one idea after another. Thus, it is difficult not to presume that one idea comes before another, to put them in an order, to imagine the cause and effect implicit in such an ordering, to start the unconscious production of hierarchies for which the human mind has such a profound facility. Unlike writing, painting has the gift of gestalt, an immediate apprehension of a situation composed of both its whole and its parts, or parts that exceed the whole, or a whole that is comprised of parts both present and absent. This is the force of visual information. This is the force of the intelligence of art. This is what pictures do before, during, and after our attempts to discuss what it is we see when we look at them. Farber was one of the first critics to take this capacity of painting and use it as an interpretive tool for how to look at film. This is why the details of an actor's performance, or the choice of the chairs and table on a set, or the way the camera is moving, or the way the light is being played out, is so crucial in Farber's criticism. He is trying to look at the film all at once, rather than allowing himself to be sidelined by linear narrative. Each shot is a composition. Each edit is a new offer. Farber's criticism was a way of articulating the and of all of the particularities that give film its totality. And Farber's willful breaking of language was his way of forestalling the film's linearity for as long as possible. One of the best descriptions of the sympathetic relationship between Farber's writing and his picture making comes from the critic Kevin Parker, who wrote, and I love this sentence, I wish I could have written this sentence: synecdoche expands space by enabling a small part to stand for the whole. A synecdoche, on the other hand, cuts space back. It is the suppression of linking words, conjunctions, adverbs, or even conventional punctuation between sentences. In Farber's paintings, these two rhetorical moves are simultaneously at work wherever you look. And just as Farber's criticism used painting as a lens to look at film, his paintings took up the logic of the essay as a form. I first encountered the writer Elizabeth Hardwick in a text by J.P. Garan, written to accompany a selection of films of the Termite tendency. A quick Google search established her provenance. I did not know who she was. She was a pedigreed writer, co-founder of the New York Review of Books, and tumultuously married to the poet Robert Lowell. Her New York Times obit reads like a screenplay about a New York intellectual whose life was undeniably caught in the undertow of feminism, but who swam parallel to the shore so steadily that she may not have admitted it. The last two paragraphs read, and this is the last two paragraphs of the obit of Catherine Hardwicke. In a 1984 interview in the Paris Review, the writer Darrell Pickney asked her about her feelings about getting older. "You can always ask," Ms. Hardwicke responded, quote, "its only value is that it spares you the opposite, not growing older. People do cling to consciousness, and under the most dreadful circumstances. It shows you that it's all we have, doesn't it? Waking up, the first and last privilege, waking up again." When Mr. Pickney asked her, quote, "Do you think it is more painful for women than men?" she replied, "More about women and men, about something so burdensome it doesn't seem valuable to make distinctions. Oh, the dear grave. I like what Gottfried Brenn wrote, something like, quote, 'May I die in spring when the ground is soft and easy to plow.'" Tracking down Goran's citation and reading Hardwicke's obituary made me think of Moira Davies' writings and her video essays, treasure maps composed of footnotes. Whenever I think of Moira, I imagine her notebooks filled with the words of other people. Davy was in the MFA program at UCSD, and she was one of the TAs for Manny's last famous class. She didn't start making her own video essays until much later, when her son was old enough to fend for himself, and after a long period of working as an editor for a small publisher. Clearly, she had been influenced by Goran's essay films, but in the best way, long after her exposure to them, so that the influence is more of a faded trace than a strongly drawn line. For Hardwicke, the, quote, "aggressiveness of the essay is the assumption of the authority to speak in one's own voice." And her essays, quote, "are addressed to a public in which some degree of equity exists between the writer and the reader." I think that Farber was ambivalent and suspicious of the authority of the first-person pronoun, and reading Hardwicke's account of the essay helped me understand why Farber had tacked toward the seemingly timeless terrain of still life and landscape, genres whose purchase on the everyday remain unrivaled. Who hasn't made an ersatz still life arrangement? And everyone lives in a landscape. By this I mean to suggest that it is not only the accessibility of such imagery that matters, it is also the structural connections of that kind of imagery to people's lived daily lives that takes on a special role in Farber's slightly ham-fisted American populist hands. And yet for Farber, ever the contrarian, populism only goes so far. For any viewer of a Farber painting knows that his work assumes your familiarity with the flowers of late Manet, the apples of Cézanne, the spatial flights of fantasy of early Picasso, single-point perspective, the dragon of conventional composition, and its St. George, the expansive fields of abstract expressionism. To look at a Farber painting is to be aware of late modernism's fetish for flatness and anti-illusionism. It is to recognize Ellsworth Kelly's recuperation of color. It is to see the ukiyo-e print's confirmation of the influence of Japan, and to see in Farber's use of stencils a nod to Jasper Johns. It is, in other words, to see a field littered with objects and images laden with referential meaning. Their organization, however, breaks from any modernist pretense to order. The words centrifugal and meandering appear again and again in the writing about Farber's pictures. Jonathan Crary keenly observes the, quote, willfully unreconciled spatial systems at work. As it did for countless numbers of still life painters before him, the terrain of the everyday, as mapped by Farber, exists on a tabletop. But whereas previous painters used the tabletop as a site of relative stability, Farber's pictures start out on a horizontal plane of the table that then tilt violently, elastically, euphorically to embrace the verticality of the wall. The extreme literalness of Farber's move from horizontal making to vertical presentation always summons for me the work of that great other gymnast of the everyday, my hero, Robert Rauschenberg. Farber's practice evokes Leo Steinberg's still trenchant essay from 1972, Other Criteria, in which the deeply insightful critic comes to terms with the radical implications of Rauschenberg's work by coining the term flatbed picture plane. For Steinberg, the work of art made on the tabletop was produced in the space of work. It was about the language of the printing press and kitchen counters and the draftsman's table. Steinberg saw this as a profound shift in worldview, from a painting that imagined itself as a window offering a view out into the world, to an artwork that behaved as if it was at work in the world. The change in pictorial orientation was analogous to a larger societal shift in the wake of World War II, from the modern to the postmodern, from a belief in rational order to a belief in entropy, from art as illusion to the art of the actual, from the idealized to the pedestrian. Farber's work is sensitive to these arguments and the deliberate heterogeneity of the objects in his paintings, his confounding of the spatial relations between individual detail, and his proliferation of ways in and out of the picture, means that his pictures enact the postmodern sensibility that revels in the hopelessness of all systems of organization, of storage, of categorizing. One of the defining features of the postmodern era is that knowledge became more horizontal and networked, less vertical and hierarchical. We might even say that Farber, Steinberg, and Rauschenberg were all at work on this considerably profound paradigm shift. Rather than the old Enlightenment conception of knowledge as functioning like a tree with its central trunk and many branches and its intense verticality, lifting, craning ever up toward the sun, Deleuze offered us the metaphor of the rhizome, an image of knowledge, culture, and human organization that escaped categorization, that ran horizontally along the ground, splitting into networks that break off from one another like errant rivulets, only to find a confluence with ideas that had germinated elsewhere. Farber's pictures visually play out the rhizomatic impulse. They behave like essays as described by Hardwick, in which, quote, an essay is nothing less than the reflection of all there is, art, personal experience, places, literature, portraiture, politics, science, music, and education, and just thought itself in orbit. This is where Farber's canvases really move the needle for me. His still life paintings avoid the genre's historical pitfalls. No vanitas moralizing, no staging of objects as a form of psychological displacement. The everyday objects strewn about Farber's canvases are not placed there as a pretense at formal exploration. To see him as updating Cézanne's play with apples, if what you see in Cézanne's apples is the use of an everyday negligible thing, so that the artist could better concentrate on the formal and spatial problems of painting as such, is to miss the point of Farber. Farber wasn't trying to reinvent the language of painting, because he didn't seem to treat it as a grandiose act. In Routine Pleasures, J.P. Garand quotes him as saying, and this is Farber, "Life isn't too big a deal and shouldn't be painted as such." Farber painted Deleuzian pictures from the position of the carpenter he had once been. He painted them to figure out how to make a picture, not of how the world looked, but of how it functioned. In this regard, he may have shared the poet Charles Olson's understanding of metaphor, and this is Olson. Metaphor is not what a thing is like, it's how it behaves. In Farber's Termite essay, it becomes clear that the details of an actor's performance or the particularities of the mise en scène are what make the enterprise real for him. They are what grounds it and bestows upon it its legitimacy. It is not the devil, but reality that lives in the details. And without the details, all you have is a white elephant story. All you have is a big Jeff Koons sculpture. This is why one of my favorite scenes in Khalil Joseph's Flypaper, currently on view at the PDC, is one in which a young woman sits with a child underneath an open window. Their physical intimacy leads us to believe they are mother and son, and as they sit close and still, they watch with evident pleasure a diaphanous curtain blow in the breeze. The vignette is an offering of time slowed, time suspended, of air defying gravity ever so provisionally. It's why I love Dyke Blair's gouache of an empty chair in an airport. It's why I find it so devastating, the relief of it, to know that one's loneliness has already been accounted for. It's why seeing myself reflected in extreme miniature in the chrome of Josiah McElhaney's An End to Modernity always feels so pleasurable. Finally, I am depicted at a scale that feels appropriate to my place in the multiverse. The everyday. I have long wondered exactly what it is we're talking about when we talk about the everyday. Since I am not interested in masterpieces to the point of being allergic, or war, or a theory of everything, or people who insist on their rightness, I tend to stick pretty close to the quotidian. But still, just where and what is that? Is it the sound of mourning doves at dawn? The laundry? The dust under the bed? The picked-at cuticle? Is it how you arrange your desk or how you like your breakfast? Is it the photographs we remember so well that we think they are our own memories? Is it the microaggressions of everyday racism? The casual sexism of the office? Is it the way we idly scroll past the parts of the newspaper that don't speak to us? Just like that staggering scene in Jean Dillman, where Delphine spreads the newspaper out on the Immaculate dining room table and turns page after page, but reads nothing? Is it the contents of the junk drawer? Is it the oil stains on the driveway? Is it the water bill? In the words of Georges Parekh, quote, "It matters little to me that these questions should be fragmentary, barely indicative of a method, at most of a project. It matters a lot to me that they should seem trivial and futile. That's exactly what makes them just as essential, if not more so, than all the other questions by which we've tried in vain to lay hold to our truth." The everyday implies an endlessly horizontal proliferation of concerns, each with its own specific tonality, each with its own tributaries. To be truly curious about the water bill is to open out onto the systems of the state and its putative concern for the common good of its citizens. It is to encounter the phenomenon of money, power, and the discourse of resources. It is to attend to the monthly time of the billing cycle and the daily time of the drip irrigation system. It could become a conversation on the relative merits and pleasures of showers and baths, the effectiveness of dishwashers, and the women's work that is never done. It is a way of thinking about all of the flowers in Farber's paintings, the ones laid flat on the canvas, the vegetables with the dirt still attached to their roots. It is to speak of the vases filled with flowers arranged by Patricia. It is to understand the repeated nature of the activity of making. It is to see it all as an endless performance, the sowing and weeding, the selecting and arranging, the trimming down and the discarding, the washing the slime out of the vase, the starting over again. It is to think in the realm of the verb, of the gerund and the infinitive. It is to be invested in the process of things. It is to know the pleasure of process resolving itself into a noun. It is to loosen one's dependence on one's proper name, a name, after all, bestowed upon you by others who did not yet know you at the time of their Adamic act. And to paint that gift economy over and over, to double down on the sunflower in the blue vase, to paint it twice from two different angles in the same painting. To do this is to recall the opening line of Olson's poem, The Kingfishers. What does not change is the will to change. Farber's pictures are about the timelessness of change, the beautiful banality of a lifelong love, the small pleasures of a job well done. To make work of this kind is to see that space and time are indeed inextricable. It is to know that everything happens one day at a time. Thank you.